So today I wanted to talk about the La Dispute record, Panorama, an album I know that at least I have been eagerly anticipating for quite a while. La Dispute being one of my favorite bands ever, and in particular their 2011 album Wildlife is one of my favorite albums this decade. For the uninitiated, La Dispute are a vaguely rock and or punk band out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, known particularly for the intense and visceral vocal stylings of lead singer Jordan Dreyer, as well as the poetry and perspective that his lyrics contain, offering up a strange synthesis of spoken word and screamo, a technique that has only become more controlled and effective with each release by this band. And La Dispute instrumentally has always been in service of Jordan, while still being willing to explore new territories with each successive album. In particular, the band are known for putting out experimental releases in between their major projects so that they can get a feel for whatever new direction they want to explore. Since the release of their previous album, Rooms of the House, the band have gone on tour and done acoustic shows at smaller venues, where they approached more obscure songs from their discography and presented them in a stripped-down, more low-key fashion, setting them alongside poetry readings and Q&As with the audience. Additionally, they composed the instrumental soundtrack for their documentary Tiny Moving Dots. And finally, they released another song in their long-running series of experimental singles, Here Here. The track, simply known as 13, was probably the darkest and sparsest song that they've written to date, leaning much harder into their spoken word influences than ever. So, going into Panorama, my expectations were that they might play with more auxiliary instrumentation. They brought out trumpets and melodicas, among many other instruments during their acoustic tour, which I had the pleasure to see, as well as maybe the record being a bit more somber and low-key because of the presence of 13. But on Panorama, we actually see them stylistically following up Rooms of the House with a very similar but more mature take on that dry indie rock sound that they were exploring, which I'm sure for some people is an absolute travesty. To my knowledge, Rooms of the House is not looked on favorably by all La Dispute fans. But while I think that the two records are instrumentally similar, I think that Panorama goes well out of its way to address the failings and shortcomings that Rooms of the House had going on. Namely, that Rooms is distinctly not fun to listen to. Jordan has tackled a lot of very traumatic topics over the years, but on Rooms, he was really tackling such tiny moments of collapse that it was hard to get drawn in by any sort of catharsis or epiphanies that were being presented. Hey guys, here's a concept album about a divorce happening over like a very long period of time. That's gonna be great! So the hook on Panorama is really that thematically there isn't much of a story or specific concept going throughout the record. Lyrically, Jordan is talking in much broader strokes about just grief and anxiety in general, which is not to say that there aren't very lush and detailed images that he's presenting on this record, so much as there aren't stories about very specific events that you get caught up in. Which means we get to see the band, not resting on a hook to sell us this album's greatness. And for that, I think that this record is, for good or bad, the easiest La Dispute record to listen to. In like a purely practical way. I mean, if I put on Wildlife, I know that the tears are coming. Like, I have to get ready for that. It's not casual listening. And even more so for their first record, like, that album is just so visceral and aggressive instrumentally that it's exhausting. So it's actually kind of refreshing, at least to me, on Panorama to have a short, concise La Dispute record that I can just put on. I don't need a parachute or a straitjacket or comfort food or Kleenex. I can just like this. Starting off the record is a little instrumental intro called Rose Quartz. The band have mentioned in the accompanying book to this record that they spent a lot of time working with auxiliary electronic textures, which for the most part just stay in the background and add to the ambiance. They don't really overstay their welcome. From there we get the 1-2 punch of the Fulton Street tracks. Fulton Street 1 wound up on my best songs of the year for last year because it was released ahead of this album. And while I think it's kind of an odd choice for an opener since it is such a slow-burning, intense song that builds up over its runtime, I do think that lyrically it's a good introduction to the very sparse themes that Jordan is going to be exploring here. We get imagery of northern Michigan, lots of forests, dark roads, roadside memorials where crashes have occurred, general feelings of anxiety, like that the darkness is closing in on you, that you're not as great as you are, that you aren't living up to potential. You know, getting all of that moodiness stirred up into this northern gothic stew of ice and existentialism. Fulton Street 2, I feel like, is a little more ho-hum. It reminds me of the first couple of tracks on Rooms of the House, which are always more aggressive than I remember them being. There's an even more direct buildup of aggression on this song than the first Fulton Street, and they feed into each other reasonably well. Like, I must say, listening to this on vinyl, the whole A-side just runs pretty seamlessly. Again, like, this record is much easier to listen to than their previous ones to me. From there, we go into Road Night and Grief, which is one of the other singles for this record. This track has some horns very prominently in it, performed by their guitarist Chad, who, until reading their accompanying book, I hadn't realized has actually played trumpet in the background on all of their records on at least one song. And it definitely gives this song a very distinct flavor to it, helps it stick out from the bunch. After that is Anxiety Panorama, which is one of the few songs I would describe on this record as openly aggressive. It's got a driving beat and all these very frantic guitar lines as Jordan is going absolutely crazy. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Stay Happy there off of Rooms of the House, though it flows a lot more naturally than that very chaotic track. And finishing out side A is In Northern Michigan, which is a very quiet and bleak track with a lot of spoken word elements to it. If any song on here reminds me of that track 13 that they did, it's this one. Just listening through it on like a streaming service or CD or something, maybe this feels like a loss of momentum, but it closes out side A really well on the vinyl release. And it's not like you have two slow songs right in a row, because the next track on this record, Views from Our Bedroom Window, picks up the pace a little bit more. What I really like on this song is the lead guitar lines on the verses kind of feel like what a vocal melody might look like over top of this. Since Jordan's vocal style is mostly spoken and doesn't really have a melodic quality to it on most songs, it's kind of interesting to have a lead like this that's just so obviously melodic. Other than this, the track kind of reminds me of Rooms of the House a bit. From there we go to Footsteps at the Pond, which in my opinion is the best song on the record, and besides Anxiety Panorama is the other most aggressive song on the record. Right from the get-go, there's just a lot more energy going in on this song than most of them, and it sustains it for longer too. Most of the tracks on this record at some point do reach a frantic fury, but they don't usually stay there for very long. The band really want to be more dynamic on this release. But here's the banger. They let off the gas on this song like ever so briefly, like 2/3 the way through it, and then they just go right back. From there, the final two songs, Hiding Place and You Ascendant, are a little bit more low-key. You Ascendant in particular is a lot more on the spoken word side. It is bleak, it is the longest song on the record, and so dense lyrically that it's probably going to take me a lot longer than this first week that I've had with this album to really, unfurl all of it, which is a quality that I really do enjoy about the band. It's kind of like listening to rap music, where some of the best stuff you really need to sit on and chew over, and years and months later you might have an epiphany about what something means or what some of the subtext is going on there. And there's several points on this record where there is allusions to other tracks in the band's discography, some of which even feels like rebuttals to the, thoughts and ideas presented in those other songs. So yeah, overall, I've really liked this record so far. I don't know whether or not the music here is necessarily a progression of their sound. It might just be a rebuilding record, seeing as they had some personnel shift around in the band. But this is a La Dispute record that I feel like I could approach people with. In the past, I've referred to getting into La Dispute as telling somebody, hey, if you fall down this set of stairs enough times, you'll think it's poignant. This record doesn't hurt. I think it's short, it's concise in both its styling and minimal theming. It's a good representation of what this band can do. And as ever, I am a dirty, dirty boy for anything that this band does. In my mind, there's not a true dud in their whole discography, and it continues to be rewarding to see them evolve and mature since their darling days. And with that, I think I'll wrap up this review. Thanks, as always, for listening to my cruddy opinions. Ciao.